1. The Meteorite. Dan and his sister Helen had been making a telescope in an old hut. Helen looked at the trees with the telescope.
Come on, Helen,
Said Dan.
let me look. It is my telescope as well. I did help to make it.
Helen let him look. Dan looked at the trees too. The telescope made them look so big he could see a bird in one of them,
We can look at the stars at night.
said Helen.
We cannot see them now. The sun is too bright. Let us look at the sun then.
Said Dan.
No, Dan.
Said Helen.
You must never look at the sun with a telescope. What did Tom tell us? He said the light is very bad for the eyes.
Said Dan. Tom worked for Mr. Bunting at the observatory. They had big telescopes there.
Let us take the telescope to the observatory so Tom can see it.
Said Dan.
He did tell us how to make it.
When they got to the observatory, Tom had just put a tyre on his car. Dan put down the number of the car in a little book. The number was OND 884B,
He collects the numbers of all the cars he sees.
said Helen. Tom smiled.
He must have a lot of numbers.
He said.
Look,
Said Helen. She held out the telescope. Tom put it to his eye.
That is very good.
He said. They did not see Mr. Bunting come up to them,
What are you doing here?
said Mr. Bunting. Dan and Helen wanted to run away,
They want to find out about the stars.
said Tom.
Splendid, splendid.
Said Mr. Bunting.
Would you like to see round the observatory?
Mr. Bunting's telescope was in a big round room. The roof could open, and the telescope could look at the sky.
This telescope is not like yours.
Said Mr. Bunting.
There is a mirror inside it. The mirror reflects the light from the stars and makes them look bigger. We call it a reflecting telescope.
There was a bigger telescope in another round room.
This is like your telescope, but bigger.
Said Mr. Bunting.
This roof can open too, and the telescope can turn to look at the sky. We can take pictures of what we see in the telescope.
He picked up a big picture. Dan and Helen had never seen so many stars.
There are lots more stars in space.
Said Mr. Bunting.
how big is space?
Said Dan.
Space keeps going forever.
Said Tom. Then Mr. Bunting picked up a funny-looking stone.
This came from space.
He said.
What? This old stone?
Said Dan.
Yes,
Said Mr. Bunting.
stones like this shine in the sky as they fall. We call them meteorites.
They get so hot, they shine like stars.
Said Tom.
I wish I could find a stone from space.
Said Dan.
A meteorite?
Said Mr. Bunting.
A meteorite?
Said Dan. That night, Dan and Helen were in the hut. Helen was looking at the stars with the telescope. Suddenly, Helen said,
Dan, look! What is it?
said Dan. They looked up into the sky. A bright light was coming down over the trees. Two. The spinning compass. Dan and Helen looked at the bright light,
Is it a meteorite?
said Dan,
It is very big.
said Helen,
It is going down over the trees.
said Dan,
It is gone.
said Helen,
Let us go and find it.
said Dan,
No,
said Helen.
we will never find it at night. Then let us look for it in the morning.
Said Dan.
Keep the telescope as it is. It will tell us the way to go.
In the morning, they went back to their hut. They had a map with them, and Dan had his compass. They looked in the telescope again and saw the trees. Dan looked at the map.
This is what we can see in the telescope.
He said. Then he made a cross,
This is the hut.
he said. He put his compass on the cross.
The trees are northwest from here. This is where the meteorite fell. We just keep going northwest.
It was a long way to the trees, and they had to keep stopping to look at the compass. But at last they got to the trees and started looking for the meteorite.
That is funny.
Helen said.
I cannot hear any birds. Maybe they don't like this wood.
Said Dan. He looked at his compass. The needle was spinning round and round.
Why is it spinning round?
Said Helen.
I don't know.
Said Dan. Suddenly, Helen wanted to get out of the wood. She began to run, and Dan ran to keep up with her. When they got out of the wood, they saw an old sandpit. Dan's compass was all right again.
Look,
He said.
there is north. The sandpit is northwest.
They went into the sandpit.
It looks like the moon.
Said Helen. Dan began looking for the meteorite, when suddenly something went beep, 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 beep. They looked round. The sound stopped.
It could have been a bird.
Said Helen.
No,
Said Dan.
that was not a bird. Maybe a boy's doing it.
Said Helen.
Come on out.
Dan shouted.
We can see you.
Peep, 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 went the sound again.
That is not boys.
Said Dan.
Where is it coming from?
Said Helen.
I don't know.
Said Dan. They did not like it. They could not see anything. Helen wanted to find out what it was, but Dan wanted to get out of the sandpit. They were just going when it began again.
Over there.
Said Dan. The sound was coming from the other side of the sandpit. Suddenly, it stopped again. A car was coming up to the sandpit. It stopped, and a thin man got out. He had a mac and a hat on. The man came towards them. They could see he was very cross. They could see he wanted them to go. They began to run, and the man ran after them. Suddenly, Dan fell. 3. The Man in the Sandpit. The thin man ran towards Helen and Dan. Suddenly, he stopped and put his hands to his eyes. Dan and Helen ran off and hid. They were very scared.
Can you see him?
Said Dan.
No.
Said Helen.
Maybe he's given up.
Said Dan.
Why did he go for us like that? He did not want us there.
Said Helen.
Did you see how he looked at us?
Yes.
Said Dan.
And did you see the funny way he ran? It was a good thing he did not come after us in his car.
Said Helen.
The car!
Said Dan suddenly.
We must go back to the car. You don't have to come if you don't want to. What if he sees us?
Said Helen.
He thinks we have run off.
Said Dan. They went back to the sandpit. The man was there. He was looking round. He got something from the car, but they could not see what it was.
I wish we had the telescope.
Said Helen.
He is looking for something.
Said Dan.
Do you think it is something to do with that sound? That sound stopped when he came.
Said Helen. The man went on looking round.
I want to look at his car.
Said Dan.
No,
Said Helen.
he will see you. You stop here.
Said Dan.
If he starts to go back to the car, shout. No, Dan. Come back.
Said Helen. But Dan would not stop. Dan got to the car without the man seeing him. He wanted to see the car number. He got right up to the car. But then the thin man saw him and came running up. Helen gave a shout.
Dan!
As Dan ran off, the man got inside the car and went after him. Dan just got out of the way as the car went by him. Helen ran up to him. She was very cross.
I told you to stop with me.
She said.
He was going to kill you. I don't think so.
Said Dan.
He just wanted to get away. I got what I wanted. The car number is OND 884B.
Dan got out his little book.
Look at the last number.
He said to Helen.
It was Tom's car. The man must have taken it. Yes.
Said Helen.
And his hat. And his Mac. Shall we go to the police?
Said Dan.
Let us tell Tom about it.
Said Helen. The funny sound started again. So Dan and Helen went back to the sandpit. Suddenly, a boy came out of the sandpit. His hair was white. He had silver clothes, and they were shining in the sun. He looked very scared. Dan and Helen were scared too. The sound they could hear was coming from him. Four. The boy came up to them. He held up a hand to keep the sun from his eyes.
He is from space.
Said Dan.
He must be. Look at his silver clothes. How can he be from space?
Said Helen.
That light we saw last night. That was his spaceship.
Said Dan. The boy made the sound again.
He wants to tell us something.
Said Dan.
Keep back.
Said Helen. The boy made more sounds.
Who are you?
Said Helen. But the boy did not understand.
Listen,
Said Dan.
my name is Dan.
He pointed at Helen.
This is my sister, Helen. Got that? Dan, Helen.
The boy pointed at himself. Peep, peep, he went.
Was that his name?
Said Helen.
It must be.
Said Dan.
Hello, Peep Peep.
He said, and held out his hand. The boy jumped back and looked very upset.
We want to help you.
Said Dan, and he smiled. The boy looked at them. He smiled too, and held out his hands. Dan and Helen held out their hands.
He wants to come with us.
Said Helen.
Let us take him to Tom.
Said Dan.
We can tell Tom about the car, too.
When they got to the observatory, Tom was not there. The boy looked ill.
I think the light is too bright for his eyes.
Said Dan. Helen ran to Mr. Bunting's room.
I had to come up, Mr. Bunting.
She said.
We have a boy outside from space.
Mr. Bunting put down his pen.
What was that?
He said.
From space?
Helen told him all about it. Then she ran to get Dan and the boy. Mr. Bunting looked at the boy and listened to the sounds he made.
This is fantastic. Fantastic.
He said.
Is he from space?
Said Helen.
I don't know.
Said Mr. Bunting.
Let us try to find out.
He picked up a map.
This is a map of the planets that go round the sun.
The sun.
Said Dan, looking at the map.
It looks like a star. The sun is a star.
Said Helen. The boy looked at the map. He pointed at one of the planets, number 3 from the sun.
Yes,
Said Mr. Bunting.
that is this planet, the Earth. He knows where he is.
The boy picked up Mr. Bunting's meteorite. Then he pointed to the planet Mars, number 4 from the sun. He put his hands out. They looked at him. He went on putting his hands out.
I know. He is collecting something.
said Dan.
Collecting meteorites from the planet Mars.
Said Mr. Bunting.
So his spaceship went to Mars to collect meteorites.
Said Dan.
And then it came here.
Then where is it?
Said Mr. Bunting. The boy had picked up Mr. Bunting's pen. He did not understand what it was. Mr. Bunting began writing with it. Then the boy began writing with it too. He held out his writing to them.
We cannot read it.
Said Mr. Bunting. The space boy looked very upset. He pointed again at his writing. Suddenly, he fell to the floor and lay still. Mr. Bunting got down by the boy and looked at him.
He is ill.
He said.
What is it?
Said Dan.
I don't know.
Said Mr. Bunting.
I wish I did know.
There must be something we can do.
Said Helen.
His eyes are open again.
Said Mr. Bunting.
Help me to get him up.
They picked the boy up.
I am going to take him to the hospital.
Said Mr. Bunting.
He is ill.
Will they know what to do?
Said Dan.
They will do what they can.
Said Mr. Bunting.
I will get my car.
The thin man was outside the observatory. When Mr. Bunting got his car, he did not see the thin man was there. Dan and Helen helped Peep-Peep into the car. They did not see the thin man, but he saw them with Peep-Peep.
I am going over Rabbit Hill.
Said Mr. Bunting.
It is a bad road, but if I go that way, I will soon be at the hospital.
Yes.
Said Helen.
I want you to stop here.
Mr. Bunting went on.
When Tom comes, tell him all about it. I cannot think where he is.
We saw Tom's car.
Helen began.
If anybody telephones,
Said Mr. Bunting.
tell them I will be back as soon as I can. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
The children said.
Goodbye, Peep-Peep.
The car went off down the road. When they got back inside the telescope room, Helen said,
I wanted to tell him about Tom's car. And about the man we saw in the sandpit. Maybe that man has got Tom.
Said Dan.
Yes.
Said Helen.
He had Tom's mac on. And his hat.
The telephone began to ring. Helen picked it up.
This is Stratton Observatory.
She said.
Mr. Bunting is out. But he will be back soon. What is your name?
It was a Mr. Miller. Helen looked for the pen, but it dropped on the floor. When Dan picked it up, he saw Peep-Peep's writing. He picked that up as well. Helen was writing Mr. Miller, and Dan was trying to read the funny writing.
I wish we could read it.
He said, as Helen put down the telephone. Helen looked at Dan's compass. The back of it was like a mirror. It was reflecting the writing. Helen could read it.
In danger.
She read.
What?
Said Dan. Helen said,
The back of your compass is reflecting Peep-Peep's writing. I will show you. Give me the compass.
Helen held the compass so that it reflected Peep-Peep's writing.
In danger.
Said Dan.
What danger? And who is in danger?
said Helen.
Is Peep Peep in danger?
Are we in danger?
Said Dan.
We must tell Mr. Bunting. Can we telephone the hospital?
Yes.
Said Helen.
We will ring up when he gets there.
We must tell him that he can read Peep Peep's writing in a mirror.
Said Dan.
We must tell him there is danger.
The thin man hid in the wood on Rabbit Hill. He had a space gun with him. As Mr. Bunting's car went by, he pointed the space gun. The car stopped. Six. Where is Tom? When the car stopped, Peep Peep looked round.
It is all right, my boy.
Said Mr. Bunting.
You sit there. I will see if I can get the car going.
They did not see the thin man. At the observatory, Helen looked up the number of the hospital in the telephone book.
They must be there by now.
Said Dan. But when Helen telephoned the hospital, Mr. Bunting was not there. She talked to a man about Peep Peep, but he would not listen.
We are not making it up.
She said, but the man put down the telephone.
Now what?
Said Dan. On Rabbit Hill, Mr. Bunting could not make the car start. Peep Peep kept trying to tell him that they were in danger, but Mr. Bunting did not understand. Suddenly, Mr. Bunting saw Tom's car coming.
Splendid, splendid,
He said.
We shall be all right now.
Peep Peep did not think so. Tom's car stopped, and the thin man got out. He had taken off Tom's mac and hat. His hair was white. He had silver clothes on, and they were shining in the sun. He was from space.
What on earth is going on?
Said Mr. Bunting.
He must have come for you, Peep Peep.
The spaceman came up to them.
We did the best we could for him.
Said Mr. Bunting. The spaceman pointed his space gun at Mr. Bunting. Then he made Peep Peep get out of the car.
Tell him we were trying to help you.
Said Mr. Bunting. But Peep Peep looked scared. Peep Peep had a book in his hand. The spaceman pulled it out of his hand, and it dropped on the road.
That is my book.
Said Mr. Bunting. The spaceman pointed his space gun at the cars. They began to melt. Soon there was nothing left. In the telescope room, Dan and Helen were talking about Mr. Bunting.
If he was at the hospital, he would telephone us.
Said Helen.
Do you think the man from the sandpit has got them?
Said Dan.
Why?
Said Helen.
He may be another spaceman.
Said Dan.
Why would Peep Peep want to get away from another spaceman?
Said Helen.
Maybe he's a bad spaceman and he wants to kill Peep Peep. Maybe lots of spaceships came down last night. Maybe they want to take over the Earth.
Maybe you read too many space books.
Said Helen.
You read them too.
Said Dan. They did not know what to do. Where was Tom? Where were Peep Peep and Mr. Bunting?
I'm going to look for them.
Said Helen.
No!
Said Dan.
There may be spacemen outside. If they have Tom, Peep Peep and Mr. Bunting, they will want us too.
I'm going to telephone the police.
Said Helen. Helen picked up the telephone. There was no sound.
We have been cut off.
She said.
There is somebody outside.
Said Dan.
He is coming in.
7. The hunt for the car. It was Tom.
What are you doing here?
He said. The children were pleased to see him.
They did not get you, after all.
Said Dan. Tom looked at them.
What are you talking about? Where is Mr. Bunting?
He went off to the hospital.
Said Helen.
Why has Mr. Bunting gone to the hospital?
Said Tom.
Is he ill?
No, Peep Peep is ill.
Said Dan. Tom sat down. He did not understand.
All right. Start again. Please.
He said. The children told Tom about the light in the sky and the hunt for the meteorite. They told him how they had seen his car in the sandpit.
You saw my car.
Said Tom, who had been looking everywhere for it. Then they told him all about Peep Peep.
A boy? From space?
Said Tom.
We are not making it up.
Said Helen.
Mr. Bunting thinks he is from space.
Said Dan.
Why?
Said Tom.
He has white hair and silver clothes, and he talks in a very funny way.
Said Dan. He did his best to sound like Peep Peep. Then the children let him see the boy's writing. Helen got a mirror from her bag so that Tom could read it.
But how did he learn to write like this?
Said Tom.
And why is the writing back to front?
Then they told him about the telephone.
It has been cut off.
Said Helen. Tom picked it up.
You are right.
He said.
Which way did Mr. Bunting go?
Over Rabbit Hill.
Said Helen.
I am going to look.
Said Tom.
Please let us come too.
Said Helen.
Okay.
Said Tom.
But you must do as I tell you.
The spaceman had taken Peep Peep and Mr. Bunting into the spaceship. He put them in a room. Suddenly, a big window shut them in. There was another spaceman in the room. Peep Peep ran to him. It was his father. There were meteorites everywhere. Mr. Bunting looked at the thin spaceman on the other side of the big window. The spaceman was trying to make the spaceship start. Peep Peep's father pointed at the thin man and then at all the meteorites.
I think I understand.
Said Mr. Bunting.
That man wants all the meteorites. Is that it?
Peep Peep's father put a funny ring on his finger. He could write mirror writing with this ring. He began writing on some plastic.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Said Mr. Bunting.
But I cannot read it. Why do you think I can?
On Rabbit Hill, Tom, Helen and Dan looked at the tracks made by the cars.
I think my car made these tracks.
said Tom.
The front track is like the tire I put on my car.
These tracks just stop.
Said Dan. They looked round for the cars.
Cars don't just melt.
Said Tom. Then Helen saw the book. She picked it up.
Reflecting telescopes.
She said.
That is Mr. Bunting's book.
Said Tom. There was some writing in the front of the book. It was mirror writing.
Peep Peep did that.
Said Dan.
It may tell us where they are.
Said Helen. She got out her mirror. Tom saw the writing reflected in her mirror.
Captured.
He said. Eight. The lake.
I was right.
Said Dan.
They have been captured by spacemen. They may be on their way to Mars by now.
We shall never see Mr. Bunting again.
Said Helen.
Yes, we will.
Said Tom.
We're going to get him back.
How?
Said Dan.
We will go to the police.
Said Tom.
They will think we made it up.
Said Dan.
If we could show them the spaceship, then they would help us.
Said Helen.
Where would you hide a spaceship?
Said Dan.
Let us start at the sandpit.
Said Tom. The thin spaceman could not start the spaceship. He made the big window melt away and came into the meteorite room. He wanted Peep Peep's father to start the spaceship, but Peep Peep's father would not help him. The thin spaceman pointed his gun at him. Was he going to kill him?
No,
Said Mr. Bunting.
don't kill him.
Peep Peep's father just looked at the spaceman. At last, the thin spaceman gave up and went out again.
He cannot start the spaceship without you, can he?
Said Mr. Bunting. But Peep Peep's father did not understand him. In the sandpit, Dan and Helen showed Tom where they had seen his car.
The man had your hat and mac on.
Said Helen.
I left them in the back of the car.
Said Tom.
But why did he put them on?
He put them on over his space clothes
Said Dan.
so that nobody could see them. He is a spaceman. I keep telling you.
Tom looked round the sandpit.
You could not hide a spaceship here.
He said.
There must be a way to find it.
Said Helen. Dan had been thinking.
My compass.
He said.
In the wood this morning, the needle began spinning round and round. Maybe the spaceship made the needle spin like that.
Let us go to the wood.
Said Tom. In the wood, the compass needle did spin round. When it stopped spinning, it was pointing away from north.
Come on.
Said Dan.
The spaceship must be that way.
They went on a little way. Suddenly, something stopped them. They could not see what it was. The children were scared.
Keep going.
Said Tom. They kept going, and at last it gave way. They all fell over. Inside the spaceship, there was a sound. It told the spaceman that somebody was coming to the spaceship. The spaceman looked at a screen. It showed him what was outside the spaceship. Behind the big window, Mr. Bunting and the others looked at the screen too. Tom, Dan and Helen came out of the wood and saw a big lake. They began to go round the lake. The compass needle kept pointing at the water.
Why is it doing that?
Said Helen.
Don't you see?
Said Tom.
That is why nobody could find the spaceship.
He pointed at the lake.
It is out there, under the water.
Nine. Captured.
How can a spaceship be underwater?
Said Helen.
There is no air in space.
Said Tom.
You take it with you and keep it inside the spaceship. So if air cannot get out, water cannot get in.
Can we get in?
Said Helen.
Can we do anything?
Said Dan.
No,
Said Tom.
there is nothing we can do.
They did not know that something was looking at them. It stood by the lake. It had a sort of eye on it. Inside the spaceship, under the lake, the thin man could see Tom, Dan and Helen on the screen. So could Mr. Bunting and the others behind the big window. Then Dan saw the eye.
Look!
He said.
Get back!
Said Tom. They ran and hid.
Is it some sort of lookout?
Said Helen.
I think so.
Said Tom.
They must know we are here.
Said Helen.
I am going to find out.
Said Tom.
You stop here. Understand? Stop here.
Tom went up to the lookout. The eye turned. There was a funny sound. Suddenly, the thin man was there on the lookout. He pointed his space gun at Tom and made him get on the lookout as well. There was another sound. They had gone.
Tom!
Shouted Helen. Tom suddenly found himself inside the spaceship. The spaceman shut him behind the big window with the others.
Hello, Mr. Bunting.
Said Tom.
I just dropped in to see you.
I did not think you would find us.
Said Mr. Bunting. The thin spaceman was still trying to get the spaceship going, but it would not start.
Peep Peep's father will not help him.
Said Mr. Bunting. He looked at Peep Peep and his father.
I wish we could talk to them.
He said.
We can.
Said Tom.
All we want is a mirror. You are going to learn to read.
Dan and Helen wanted to get help. They got up and ran for the trees. The spaceman saw them on the screen and went after them. Dan ran on and on into the wood. Suddenly, something stopped him again. He wanted to keep going, but he could not. The spaceman captured him and began to take him back to the lake. Helen hid in the trees. The mirror fell from her bag. She picked it up. Dan had said that the light was too bright for Peep Peep's eyes, so Helen made the sunlight shine into the spaceman's eyes with her mirror.
Dan, run!
She shouted. The spaceman put his hands over his eyes. Dan ran off. He came to the lookout by the lake. He did not stop to think. He got onto it. Dan suddenly found himself inside the spaceship. Everybody in the meteorite room could see him.
He did it!
Said Mr. Bunting to Tom. But in the wood, the spaceman had captured Helen and was bringing her back to the spaceship. It was all up to Dan now. Could he open the big window? In the spaceship. Dan came up to the big window.
He has got to get us out.
Said Mr. Bunting.
But how?
Said Tom. Dan could not hear them. Peep Peep pointed at the controls. Dan looked at the controls.
Which control opens the window?
He said. Suddenly, on the screen, they all saw the spaceman. He was bringing Helen back to the spaceship.
He has captured all of us now.
Said Dan. Peep Peep put the writing ring on his finger. He wrote on the big window. On the other side, Dan could read
3 down.
The writing was the right way round for him. He looked at the controls.
3 down.
He said. Peep Peep wrote again. Dan could read
2 left.
Dan put his hand on the control that was 3 down and 2 left. On the screen, they all saw the spaceman making Helen get on the lookout.
Hurry, Dan! Hurry!
Said Tom. Dan pulled at the control. Peep Peep wrote again. Dan could read.
Turn.
He turned the control, and the big window melted away. Suddenly, the spaceman and Helen were back inside the spaceship. Peep Peep's father, Tom, and Mr. Bunting ran to the spaceman and got his gun away from him. Now he was captured. They shut him in the meteorite room.
Good boy, Dan.
Said Tom.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Said Mr. Bunting.
What did you do, Dan?
Said Helen.
He got us out of there.
Said Tom, pointing to the meteorite room.
Thanks to Peep Peep.
Said Dan. Peep Peep's father had been writing for Tom and Mr. Bunting. Mr. Bunting had been right about the thin spaceman. He wanted all the meteorites for himself, so he had taken over the spaceship. But the spaceship had got out of control.
That is why it came down on Earth.
Mr. Bunting told Dan and Helen.
And that is when Peep Peep ran away and hid in the sandpit.
Said Dan.
But why did the thin spaceman want the meteorites?
Said Helen.
Meteorites are like gold where they come from.
Said Mr. Bunting.
I think their planet is like the Earth, but it is a long way away.
How did they learn to write?
Said Helen.
Yes.
Said Tom.
And why mirror writing?
Mr. Bunting held up a big plastic bag. It had mirror writing all over it.
They have been on Earth before.
He said.
They must have found this bag.
But that is mirror writing.
Said Dan.
No, Dan.
Said Mr. Bunting.
The bag is inside out.
He turned it the right way round.
You see?
Dan and Helen could read the writing on the bag. Danger. Keep away from children. There was a lot more writing on the bag.
That is how they could learn to write.
Said Mr. Bunting. He turned the bag inside out again.
But they wrote like this.
Back to front.
Said Dan.
Inside out.
Said Helen. Peep Peep and his father could understand. They could see how funny it was. By the lake, Dan gave Peep Peep his compass. Peep Peep stood on the lookout. They said goodbye. There was a sound, and then Peep Peep had gone, back inside the spaceship. There was another sound, and the lookout had also gone. That night, Mr. Bunting, Tom, Helen and Dan looked into the sky. They saw the spaceship going up to the stars.
Fantastic. Fantastic,
Said Mr. Bunting.
But we cannot tell anybody about it.
Said Tom.
Why not?
Said Dan.
They would think we made it all up.
Said Helen.